All are serious crimes. Do we say, therefore, that there is no religious freedom in Europe? Surely not. To grant these freedoms, the ordinary person would argue, is to renounce the primary duty of the criminal law, which is to protect people from abuse and to reconcile the freedom of each person with the freedom of every other. If there is a religion which obliges people to circumcise female children, or to kill adulterous wives, or to compel girls to marry against their choice, then that religion is itself a threat to freedom. In saying this, however, we are covertly endorsing a principle that is recognised by Christianity but not by Islam, the principle that it is the secular rule of law and not the religious law which determines the rights and duties of the citizen. And that principle has been expressly condemned by the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, on the authority of Ibn Taymiyyah, medieval scholar who is now all the rage in Islamist circles. It was condemned as blasphemous. Finally, there is the freedom to join in communion with others. This is an aspect of the freedom of association that has been fought for and won in Europe and America, and which is an immovable premise of the Western way of thinking. But it has always been recognised that some associations pose a threat to the state. This is particularly so of those associations that set themselves up as a rival source of authority to the state, and which attempt to usurp its legal and political functions. Freedom of association can be granted only to associations which are genuinely subordinate, and which neither challenge the authority of the state in those matters which are properly the concern of political decision-making, nor entertain rival legislative ambitions. Now, those considerations will seem reasonable to people brought up in the tradition of the Judeo-Christian Enlightenment. But that tradition is a singular one that has not been replicated elsewhere in the world. The most important religious force in the modern world is undoubtedly Islam, and it is not at all clear that Islam has accepted the status of a subordinate association in any state where it has been able to achieve a majority. Its philosophers and political theorists have done little to delimit or separate the spheres of politics and religion, although Ibn Khaldun made a stab at it. And it has never renounced its legislative ambitions or acknowledged that those ambitions must cede before secular authority. Does this mean that freedom of religion cannot be extended to Muslims? No, of course not, but it does mean that Muslims must renounce important traditional components of their faith if they are to enjoy the protection of a state which guarantees their freedom. It is a general assumption of secular government in the Western tradition that those who claim a right must also confer it, and that the religious freedoms that Muslims claim in the Dar al-Harb ought to be acknowledged and conferred in the Dar al-Islam if our governments are to be placed under an obligation to grant them. There is another freedom that comes into play when considering the place of Islam in the modern state, and that is the freedom to criticise. Few assaults on free speech in Western democracies have been as vehement as that now carried out in the name of Islam by its European adherents, who often regard public criticism of their faith as an intolerable offence, and may seek by threats and demonstrations to silence it. In September of last year, Robert Redeker, a French schoolteacher, published an article in Le Figaro arguing that Christians, when incited to violence in the name of their religion, can find no authority for this in the life and words of Christ as recorded in the Gospel. However, he went on, Muslims, incited to violence in the name of their religion, can find plenty of support for their passions in the Quran. Although manifestly true, this statement was found to be offensive by a section of Muslim opinion. Monsieur Redeker received credible death threats against himself and his family, and he and they now live in hiding under police protection. Europeans look with mounting unease and indignation on a creed that they dare not criticise, and which demands more and more space to affirm itself while yielding less and less space to its critics. It is now increasingly rare for public discussion of Islam and its stance to proceed with the open-minded concern for truth that is necessary if the discussion is to get us anywhere. Of course, mockery of another's faith is not guaranteed by freedom of speech, since mockery is a form of abuse. But it is not mockery only that Muslim activists seek to forbid, it is criticism, including the plain assertion of uncomfortable truths, such as those recently asserted by Monsieur Redeker. Freedom to criticize a religion is not a part of religious freedom, but it is one of the freedoms from which religious freedom grows. If you are allowed to criticize and even to mock Christianity, as many do, but forbidden to mock or criticize Islam, then the two faiths do not compete on equal terms. This does not mean that non-Muslims are losing their religious freedom, but the reluctance of our legislatures to take action against Islamic belligerents, to create the criminal offences necessary to prevent the intimidation of critics and opponents, is a sign that freedom is gradually slipping down the political agenda, with appeasement taking its place, as has happened before to the great cost of Europe. It should be clear, therefore, that the question of religious freedom is not only of great urgency in the world today, but also of great complexity, asking us to clarify just where freedom lies in our scheme of values. I just want to, in conclusion, therefore, to explore the conditions that have contributed to the freedom of religion that we have enjoyed in the West, and to inquire as to whether they could be reproduced elsewhere. Christ, called upon to explain the law and how we must adhere to it, said this: "Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might, and love thy neighbour as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." In other words, he presented the old prohibitions of the Old Testament as a deduction from two more fundamental commandments, which do not take the form of prohibitions, but of duties, and which enjoin nothing concrete in the world of human affairs. And he was drawing on a long tradition of Jewish thinking in reducing the Ten Commandments in that way. The two duties command us to look on the world with a view to loving what we find, and they must be obeyed inwardly before they can be translated into deeds. Exactly what deeds will follow cannot be demonstrated a priori, as he went on to show with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Approaching the world in the posture commanded by Christ, you are already open to legal innovation. Indeed, the law becomes just one among many instruments whereby we take charge of our lives and attempt to fill our hearts with the love of God and our world with the love of our neighbour. So this is a kind of retreat from law-making of the explicit earthly kind into a discipline of the heart. The duty to love God is further separated from the realm of civil law in the parable of the tribute money, in which Caesar's public jurisdiction is tacitly contrasted with the inner authority of religion, governing the person-to-person relationship between the individual and God. The words recorded in the Gospel according to St. Matthew are, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Christian commentators have emphasized the duty to God to which Christ here refers, and the need to separate religion from the taint of worldly affairs. More pertinent today is the duty to Caesar. In other words, the duty to obey the civil law and to recognize its sovereignty. Either way, Christ is making a striking pronouncement, namely that Caesar is not God. To say such a thing in the immediate aftermath of Augustus's claim to the contrary is to risk being branded as a criminal, which of course is what duly happened. Even more striking, however, is the corollary of Christ's words, namely that you should obey Caesar even though Caesar is not a god. Taken together, Christ's words lay the foundation for a new view of lawmaking as a human affair, to be conducted, like everything else, in the spirit of religion, which is the spirit of neighbour love, but not from the premise of religion. Laws are no longer to be considered as God's commandments, but as the rules of coexistence. To shape them properly, we must shape them in a spirit of love, but it is we who shape them in answer to needs of our own. From those clear but succinct pronouncements, St. Paul derived his vision of the Christian church on the model of the Roman law universitas, a corporate person subject to the civil law. The Christian communities were persecuted not because they refused to obey the law, but because they refused to worship the emperor. In other words, because they were upholding the very secular idea of jurisdiction that the Roman law had hitherto embodied, and which was being distorted by the cult of the emperor.